Welcome everyone to our May virtual presentation. Let's begin the program by asking Sasha to introduce our speaker. Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It's my great pleasure to be here tonight. I'm Sasha Mullally. I'm a professor of history at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm here to introduce to you Sean Cox, a doctoral student in our program at UNB. I'm very proud to say that he's working with me on a fabulous project, which is entitled Making Vacationland: Automotive Mobility and the Reshaping of New Brunswick and Maine from 1890 to 1939. Now, you might ask yourself what possibly could have stoked his interest in this kind of research. Well, Sean is from Maine. He was raised on the coast of Maine, and for many years he worked as a national park ranger in Acadia, one of my favorite parks in the United States, to be honest. And he worked as an outdoor educator for many years. We will get the benefit of his public speaking skills here tonight. But we'll also get the benefit of his education. He did both his BA and his MA at the University of Maine on the Maine Orono campus, where his interest in borderlands and his interest in environmental history was cultivated by the many distinguished colleagues we have on that campus who specialize in those fields. And in fact, Sean did his MA working with our own alumnus, our own UNB alumnus, Mark McLaughlin. So, notably, I also want to tell you that in his spare time, Sean is a classic car enthusiast. And it's not just because he drives an ancient Subaru, right, Sean?
Right.
Which I hope is back on the road now. Yeah.
It's survived, yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Anyway, apparently he can fix, drive, and discursively analyze anything automotive. So you can save your car questions for the Q&A. And so I guess we can see that his graduate work represents an attempt to combine both his interests in the technological as well as the natural. So if this has stoked your interest in Sean's work, I should also say that he's published elements of his research in venues like Maine History. And you can also read his work into the history of automobile laundries in the Humber River on a scholarly blog post that's hosted by Niche, the Network in Canadian History and the Environment. But that's for later. We very much look forward to your paper here tonight, Sean, entitled, of course, Fashionable Motoring and New Brunswick's Keep Left Crisis. And I think that's all from me. Over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. I will share the screen here. Okay, so to begin this topic, we are going to start with this gentleman right here in the center. This is Thomas Wilby, right here with the spectacular hat, the really dapper driving coat, gloves, and the spectacular mustache too. We'll complete the look, if you will. So Thomas Wilby is where we start our story tonight. And he was an automobile enthusiast in the very early part of the 20th century. And from what the records can tell me, he was one of the first people to cross Canada in a car. As you can see at the very back of his car here, the Halifax to Vancouver all red route. That was the venture he undertook in 1912 to drive all the way across the country. And it wasn't an easy journey for many, many reasons, some of which we'll get to discuss tonight. So we'll begin with Thomas Wilby and some of his recollections of this drive. In 1912, he wrote this account, and in one of his statements, he said that, quote, "The touring automobile continues to rank in some of the quarters of Canada as an infernal contraption imbued with the spirit of the seven devils of perversity, which must be stolidly endured but cordially ignored. Travel in the new and divisive machines was as uncommon as it was uncomfortable and unorganized. Few Canadians at this time had embraced autoing since rural roads were not yet designed for automotive travel. Routes would rarely connect the disparate provinces, and motoring laws were definitely not unified. As a pioneer in trans-Canadian autoing, Wilby wrote at length about his strenuous expedition, eloquently foreshadowing a transformation while noting significant interprovincial disorder. He wrote, "It must be confessed that on the Canadian road, the car is not yet a welcome dictator. It has not yet transformed the life of the countryside, nor shown potency to change regions primitive and somnolent into things cosmopolitan and wide awake. It has not yet transformed the village blacksmith into a garage and repair shop, nor turned the rural grocery store into a motor fuel emporium. In one province, the rule of the road is to the right, in another, to the left, and there is no talk of bringing uniformity, end quote. So Wilby's transcontinental journey began here in the Maritimes, and his account notes a mixed local response to the technology. Beyond an aversion to the automobile's odorous and loud presence, Maritime residents had the additional reason to dread the arrival of the mechanical dictator, in his words, namely the conflicting rules of the roads with neighboring Canadian and American regions. To clarify this issue, I've rendered in dubious quality a diagram to explain early motoring terms and why this is a significant thing to discuss. Firstly, we have a simple painting of a rural road and an oncoming early fashionable vehicle, very fashionable. We will assume that we, standing in the road here, are actually sitting in an equally fashionable vehicle. And we're traveling in this automobile down the road. So for many of us, placing yellow lines in the center of the road would make it a very familiar and comforting perspective. But if we're imagining that this is a dirt road or an incredibly fancy macadamized road in the early 20th century, let's take those modern lines away. It's a dirt road, you wouldn't have them. Now, the traffic is oncoming. What are we to do? If the rule of the road is turn to the left, as it was in New Brunswick, we can expect the car to move to its left and allow us to do the same, passing here in the middle, and then would return to the middle of the road. We'll get to those reasons here shortly. However, in central Canada and in the US, early Ottawists would assume that oncoming traffic would turn to the right, allowing us to drive on the much more familiar right-hand side of the road. It's not difficult to imagine, however, what this story might end up as if each driver assumed the opposite direction. So why would the rule of the road not simply mandate keep to the left or keep to the right? There were definitely urban and congested spaces that would generally force drivers to stay on their customary side. As we can see here in a photo of St. John, roughly from about 1918. We can make that assumption thanks to the Hidabera film poster on the far left. But we can also see that this is a complex mixture of hybrid mobilities in early 20th century. We have horses and carts, electric streetcars, and autos all navigating this space together, in addition to pedestrians and bicycles down the way. However, we need to also consider environmental conditions that are beyond the city limits. So these images may nearly be a century old, but the mud and the dust of these types of unpaved roads is still likely an experience we've all suffered through. Even right now, especially in the middle of pothole season, we drive to avoid damaging the cars and we swerve accordingly. So this is exactly why we stay to the middle of the road in these types of conditions. And that is then why the turn to the left or turn to the right. We're assuming that you're traveling in the middle of the road. For generations, travelers walked, rode horses, pulled carts, and yes, eventually drove cars in the middle of these rough and narrow roads until confronted with opposing traffic. Overall, this practice worked pretty well for most communities until Ottawists from away and with different customs arrived in force. Automobiles only increased the speed of confusion and collision. These conflicting practices originated long before the 20th century, but with the advent of the auto age, borders, borderlands between left and right turning regions, it became increasingly problematic, at least anecdotally. So how often were there collisions in this mobility borderland? Remarkably, few serious incidents made local newspapers, with the exception of one in September of 1917, notably, this is from the Daily Gleaner. A car from Holton, Maine collides with a driver from Fredericton on a steep curve. Though there were no fatalities, there were definitely injuries. Though, interestingly, the article doesn't explicitly blame any customary differences, but we do have oncoming different international vehicles. So why did the government of New Brunswick need to address all of these differences? I've argued in my master's thesis that the intersection of novel automobility, regional economic marginalization, and romantic naturalism produced the Vacationland Experience in Maine and New Brunswick's early 20th century. Here are just a few of many examples of early vacationing literature enticing Ottawists into these borderlands. Though Maine would claim the Vacationland slogan for my license plates in 1936, New Brunswick also used the term in many publications, such as one up here noted 1923, New Brunswick is marketing itself as Vacationland. One may ask why it would take so long for New Brunswick to address this problem. The expansion of fashionable motoring roads gradually radiated out from and connected urban spaces, as this map of suggested motoring roads in Maine does show. Notice that these roads do not typically connect with the US-Canadian border until about 1916 in the dotted lines. Similarly, in New Brunswick, the quality of driving roads would gradually expand through the 20th century, bringing more drivers with conflicting customs into conflict. This growing pressure of more cars on the road forced the topic into provincial legislatures. So by the beginning of World War I, nearly all of North America was united in the practice of keeping to the right, or turning to the right at the very least. When traveling the growing network of roads, this was almost universally the custom, except for British Columbia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Nova Scotia. So growing numbers of international Ottawists, like our friend Thomas Wilby here, still just right of center, exacerbated the differences between these provincial and national laws. And by 1917, British Columbia had enough. They voted to switch. The decision to conform with keep right laws of neighboring Washington State and Alberta and the Maritimes was then left alone with this old imperial British custom. New Brunswick, as the key borderland province separating the remaining keep left regions from the overwhelming majority of keep right governed territories, was forced to choose between tradition or adapting to new technological and economic realities. As the gateway to Nova Scotia and PEI, at least by land, New Brunswick was uniquely pressured to consider this switch carefully and question why such a change should take place for such a minority of motorists on the roadway anyway. The battle to preserve this provincial identity custom or acquiesce to external pressures demonstrates a complex mobility borderland of automotive confrontation, resistance, and adaptation, existing in a middle landscape between urban space and wilderness as a fashionable automobility radiated outward from these cityscapes and rural spaces. All of these factors set the stage for local and legislative conflict in New Brunswick. Superficially, they were arguing over the rule of the road, but clearly it involved much broader sentiments of identity and motivation. In the case of New Brunswick, fashionable autotourism had become such a compelling force that abandoning an Anglo-Maritime custom that predated New Brunswick's separation from colonial Nova Scotia made a clear economic sense, for some anyway. Thomas Wilby's contraptions could no longer at this point be cordially ignored, and the vehicular seven devils of perversity ultimately ignited uniformity movements between political jurisdictions. The middle landscape of the New Brunswick borderlands became increasingly accessible as roads were mapped and improved for motorists through good roads lobbying movements, originally started by early bicyclists to improve roads for rideability's sake, and then it just translated into a vehicular movement. As autoing transitioned from an elite hobby to a broader cultural phenomenon, locals and provincial governments had incentives to market the region as an auto-friendly retreat. Therefore, the conflicting rule of the road was a barrier that needed to be removed. In his report on permanent roads in 1918, provincial road engineer B.M. Hill voiced the reality of tourism on local New Brunswick roads. He said, "St. Andrews is visited each year by a large number of tourists, and some are visitors from the United States and Upper Canada. Nearly all of these people have their private cars, and nearly all of them pay license fee to New Brunswick. Most of these people wish to make an automobile tour of the province during their stay, and it's important that the road from St. Andrews to St. John be put in first-class condition so that these tourists will find no difficulty in getting anywhere. Systems of the province, of course, need to be improved, and the automobile traffic on this road runs as high as 600 cars a day, some days per summer." So B.M. Hill's assessment at this point in 1918, 600 cars is a significant statistic, especially traveling unpaved, frequently washed out, dusty, muddy roads. And the roads weren't just filled with foreign drivers from the States or from Upper Canada, as New Brunswickers were also gradually adopting motoring as a preferable form of mobility. Nearly 5,000 local autos were registered by the end of 1917 within the province. So we have a combination of tourists and locals now trying to navigate these road spaces. The recipient of Hill's report was the newly elected Minister of Public Works and future Premier Peter J. Vignal. Ultimately becoming a central figure in both advocating for road improvement and bringing the rule of the road issue to the legislature, Vignal would become generally admired and anointed with the name Good Roads Vignal. Not exactly one that rolls off the tongue, but clearly important for the time by the mid-1920s. The concerns raised by Hill and the citizens of New Brunswick were ultimately answered by his action in 1918 to create a comprehensive highways bill. Mounting public campaigns from local automobile associations applied pressure in New Brunswick to change the law, in addition to infrastructural support for improvement. While tourism and automotive modernity was mostly welcomed by economically struggling counties, not all of them were interested in accommodating these new visitors. The regional tensions were finally exposed in the Legislative Assembly debates of 1918. Many members of the New Brunswick Legislative Assembly supported the growing need for tourism-based economy and for infrastructural changes to attract and satisfy these visitors. Spurred on by public petitions in favor of changing the rule of the road, Vignal answered these calls by bringing an act relating to highways before the Assembly. While he introduced this bill, he justified his expertise to his colleagues, saying, "I have personally traveled 9,800 miles in automobiles and have experience with all kinds of roads, so I can claim to be more familiar with the roads than many of the honorable members of the House." The 94-part bill was briefly described, highlighting the separation of roads into trunk and branch categories, taxation, a patrol system, but also growing calls for changing the rule of the road. Vignal was personally, quote, "not wedded to a change, and for that reason, he decided to leave the question solely up to the House." While not wanting to decide on the matter personally, Vignal spoke before the House saying, quote, "In New Brunswick, there were many people who favored a change from left to right, which was shown largely by a signed petition, which Vignal had that day presented to the House as well." He also wanted to not just suggest that it was only St. Andrews that was in favor of a switch. He elaborated that he received many requests from all over the province. Quote, "Conformity with the rule in force in Quebec and Ontario and the United States. The reason was given that a large number of tourists came from these regions in automobiles, and the confusion resulting from different rules had endangered life." End quote. Having presented the case for the debate, members representing all counties from across New Brunswick fought for their local interests. This is exactly why I brought up this stylized cartoon map here for you, just in case you aren't as familiar with all of the counties of New Brunswick. I certainly still need to look at this map, being from the States. What followed was an extensive debate laced with national identity, political sniping, and regional lobbying. Francis Sweeney, representing Westmoreland County over here, came out vehemently against the change, saying, quote, "The people of the province all their lifetime had been accustomed to turn out to the left. It was the people of the province who used the roads. They did not think that they should take to the woods every time they met an American tourist in a car," end quote. Those opposed to the change, like Sweeney, clearly cited a sense of maritime identity against the onslaught of seasonal American visitors. Though a liberal, Sweeney found unlikely allies such as Hedley Dixon, a conservative from Kings County. Dixon declared his opposition to the change, reading a letter to the Assembly from a constituent, urging, quote, "that the change should not be made as it would inconvenience 1,000,000 people for the benefit of a few from the United States," end quote. Dixon's count of 1,000,000 inconvenienced Canadians can be explained by roughly combining the populations of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI into one maritime identity block. But his argument oversimplified the borderlands issue by ignoring similarly problematic traffic from right-turning central Canadian provinces. Members from both sides found common ground in resisting the calls to change, not wanting to bow to the customs of wealthy Americans simply up here on a motoring holiday. Exchanges like these, of course, were dripping with sarcasm and political posturing, while demonstrating the deep divisions between county interests in their representation. Partisan banter aside, lines were most clearly drawn not by political party, but by proximity to the different borders and economic interests in tourist traffic. Liberal Representative Fred McGee made his opinion clear, opposing the change on account of living in Westmoreland County, apprehensive of the confusion, of course. However, representatives such as William Sutton from Carleton County, point that one out over here as well too, right on the border of Maine, expressed the opposing view. Since he lived near the border of Maine, he knew the need for changing the rule of the road and expressed it would be in the interest of public safety to make it. Benjamin Smith, also from Carleton County, clearly understood the split between regional arguments, but also knew that Nova Scotia would not switch before New Brunswick switched. Yet he was satisfied that Nova Scotia would follow. They had correspondence between the legislatures, and essentially Nova Scotia put themselves in the position willing to switch, but only if New Brunswick did it first. William Roberts of St. John City reframed the debate by saying, quote, "Some accidents might result from the change, but if the present rule is continued, accidents will continue to occur. American tourists are trying to come to the maritime provinces, and obstacles should be removed from their way in order that the province might benefit from this traffic," end quote. No matter what the House ultimately decided, New Brunswick would still possess a problematic borderland between left and right-turning regions. Spatially, their existing borders with turn to the right regions included over 750 kilometers with Maine and Quebec. However, a change in the road law would reduce this problematic borderland to only 30 kilometers between New Brunswick and the more lightly populated province of Nova Scotia at the time. Once members had spent their time airing their grievance, a vote was finally called. A vote of 23 to 19 in favor of the change narrowly decided that New Brunswick would be the first maritime province to turn to the right. This decision and all of this debate placed a single sentence in the 94-part Act on Highways, changing the rule of the road for the entire province. Here's the 1918 Highways Act. This is the section 15. The single sentence that describes this change here. However, the change was also written not to come into effect immediately upon passage, but would be activated by a future order in council without a mandated timeline. This effective legislative punt satisfied most opponents by building in an unbounded grace period for residents to prepare for this new rule. New Brunswick would ultimately wait 4 years, finally acting when convinced that Nova Scotia would follow closely behind. The initial reassurances in 1918 that Nova Scotia was ready to switch if New Brunswick did apparently wavered a little bit, and it took 4 years of back and forth to justify this action. Dated July 4th, 1922, another single sentence the Order in Council forced the change in the province, bringing New Brunswick into compliance with Quebec and Maine on December 1st. Between 1918 and 1922, these two sentences entirely reoriented mobility in the province, abandoning a multi-century Anglo-Maritime custom and was in preparation for increasing waves of American and Central Canadian motorists. Internal reasoning behind the December switch is kind of difficult to source, as little official documentation has survived. Boxes of surviving official papers in the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick yield only this one handwritten note in pencil, unlabeled. This is it. It simply states that the switch would occur on December 1st, fulfilling Section 15 of the Highways Act. That's it. That's all that we have. During the 1918 debates, James Murray from Kings County had been resistant to an immediate change of the rule. He suggested, however, that, quote, to accustom horses as well as people to the change, it might be advisable to have it brought into force during the month of January, end quote. It seems reasonable that the desire to create several months of buffer before summer tourism would prompt a winter switch. This would allow locals to retrain their animals and practice the new custom themselves. Citizens of New Brunswick were frequently warned about upcoming changes from early July of 1922 onward. Announcements and articles appearing in newspapers across the region and in the borderlands documented this new switch. The St. John Globe ran a small piece 2 days after the Order in Council stating, quote, drive to the right will be the rule in New Brunswick after December the 1st. The change will bring the province into harmony with practically the whole North American continent. The rapid increase in automobile travel several years ago forced the conviction that this change, however long it might be delayed, was inevitable, end quote. The mobility of modernity brought change to New Brunswick, and it was expressed as an inevitability. Although New Brunswick was joining this harmony of North American mobility, neighboring provinces still were retaining the old rule, prompting fears of chaos on December 1st. To allay fears of automotive carnage on December the 1st, the provincial government invested in print announcements in advance of the new law. The St. John Globe published Vignau's promise that, quote, an extensive publicity campaign would be carried on to prevent, if possible, accidents taking place when the change first comes into effect. Large road signs will be erected at various points, and this turn to the right announcement was part of the campaign. While looking through the provincial archives and several other sources, I can say that images and the signs themselves are elusive in the visual historical record, unfortunately. I did, however, come across a single image that captures a road sign in New Brunswick. As you can see here, this is an image in New Brunswick, and right there, that is the only picture of the sign or any sign that I have ever found in any of the archives so far. So you can see a little lamp to light up here on the top, also indicating that that would be lit at night, so it would be visible, so you could drive through the town and obey the new rule of the road, even in pitch black. Also, per the St. John Globe, quote, drivers posted on their windshield and rear windows signs in large red lettering saying drive to the right. The frequent articles and advertisements of turn to the right ensured daily readers that they were aware of the impending switch. But Assembly members in 1918 still had beliefs that accidents would inevitably occur, and this was brought up during the original debates. December the 1st, 1922 finally arrived, and despite the persistent warnings from the Assembly members that the switch would cause chaos and confusion, maritime newspapers such as the Halifax Herald and St. John Globe reported a surprisingly smooth transition. Efforts by Vignau to prepare the province seemingly made for an easy transformation, albeit in early winter with limited traffic. The predicted scenes of car-related carnage failed to appear, and New Brunswick successfully began the maritime transition from the old country rule to an Americanized custom. The immediate lived experience for New Brunswickers, although reportedly devoid of catastrophic collisions, was still full of practical day-to-day reorientation and adjustments. Learned habits and muscle memory needed to be completely overwritten along with infrastructural particulars. The New Brunswick Power Company reportedly spent an immense amount of work converting their electric trolleys, saying, quote, "It had been necessary to remove the door operating mechanism so that the car could be used on the regular service, right up until the switch. Extensive remodeling in preparation for the switch allowed for service to remain unbroken, but required a large force of men making changes after the cars are taken to the barns Thursday night on the evening of the switch." The St. John Globe article detailed the effort, including descriptions of changes in trolley services for residents, and they also warned them that, quote, "Some delays are expected until passengers become accustomed to the location of car stops and the side on which they will board and exit the car," end quote. To reduce confusion, white bands were also purportedly painted on poles to indicate where cars will stop, hoping to make the transition smoother for their commuters. As for residents, drivers and horses faced immediate problems in adapting, as a trained habit is difficult to break all at once. The St. John Globe reported, quote, "As was anticipated, the chief difficulty so far has been with the horses. Accustomed to turning to the left, they have not yet realized that their age-old habits now have to be changed. In fact, delivery horses, which were left standing by the drivers, were seen to start off by themselves, going to the side of the road that they were accustomed to stand on." The arrival of modern mobility in New Brunswick required significant change for all, even if the change was not reportedly a catastrophic one. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Sean. That was really great. Did our first road rules have precedent in the horse in the horse and wagon era?
The turn to the left, the old tradition. Oh yeah, both traditions of turning left or turning right have a disparate history that predates the automobile by centuries and centuries. There are discussions about which side of the road you're supposed to ride or walk on, documented as far back as to the Roman rules of the road to an extent. There are medieval historians that know this a great deal better than I do, but based on my limited knowledge of history before the 20th century, there are different customs as you're walking along the road, which side would you prefer to pass a stranger on, making sure that you have your dominant hand or weapon drawing arm ready to defend yourself, or ability to get off the road and hide. So there are long dated customs well before the automobile, and different regions approached it differently. But because of imperial custom, most of the coastal sections of Canada adhered to the British identity, and the Americans, us rebels, we decided, no, we can't have that, and we have to make sure that we're different.
Next question. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not, but we'll give it a go. Thomas Wilby, was he related to the Wilbys in Fredericton? Are you familiar with the Wilby family of Fredericton?
I'm not, but I do not think he was Canadian. I believe he was actually British. I'd have to double check that to make sure, but he was not Canadian. He had been motoring on American roads for several years before his cross-country Canadian trip. And I believe he also wrote some books on American roads and British roads. But I do not believe he is related to local Wilbys.
So did everyone have the steering wheel on the same side of the car, regardless of road rules?
See, that's a great question. So because the rules of the road were varied and disparate, auto manufacturers arbitrarily kind of chose which side that they were going to put the steering wheel on. Very early cars with a tiller, of course, the tiller would be in the center of the car. As automobiles started to get wider and different steering mechanisms were implemented, they started to choose one side or another to place the steering wheel. And it wasn't really, and there are other car experts that will debate this, but many people point to the Ford Model T as one of the first and kind of the deciding factor in the debate of placing it on the left, our accustomed side of the car. So by about 1908 in North America anyway, there were a lot of auto manufacturers that started looking at what Ford was doing and then decided to copy that.
Is there any actual cases of fatal automobile accidents involving New Englanders?
Are there documented cases up here in Canada, I think? Is that the question?
Yeah, I would say documented in Canada because they were making such a fuss about the safety of tourists.
Right. Okay, so again, a fascinating question. So the members of the legislature, of course, brought this up as, oh, the Americans are coming up here and there are so many accidents and it's a risk to life and health and the well-being of our communities. In looking through the newspapers, it's kind of difficult to find explicit mentions of specifically Americans crashing into Canadians or vice versa, except for that one that I showed in 1917. But whether it was just anecdotal, whether it was a latent anti-Ottawaist fear, whether it was just a really good political talking point that they exaggerated and spun for their own political uses, I'm just not quite sure. I'm still looking into things and I love coming across stuff like this. But so far as I can tell, there aren't that many instances where this crash would have caused such a statistical, overwhelming risk to life that they had to do it for the health and safety. I think that it probably got blown out of proportion to a degree.
It's interesting that on the 1926 New Brunswick Animated Map, neither the tidal bore or the rocks are illustrated, despite the fact that they were major New Brunswick tourism attractions / locations since at least the turn of the century. I wonder why they were omitted.
A fascinating question, especially with these animated maps. There were significant stylistic choices and artistic liberty given to a lot of these artists when they were creating the maps. Sometimes they were contracted by tourism bureaus of either the state or a province or a city or even a small municipality. And it was much more common earlier in the 20th century. Animated maps started to get phased out. You don't see them quite as often, and they're more of a novelty than anything. But this one in particular, it did kind of essentialize a few things about each region, and I do not know why they omitted those specific stops. I had my advisor, Mark McLaughlin, look at this map, and he was pointing out interesting things about it too. Well, I wouldn't have chosen to put that there, or why did they choose to highlight that? So there are still definitely some questionable choices that these artists made, and I don't know how much input or review the sponsoring bureau had.
Would the turn to the right change hasten the decline of the electric motor cars?
Wow, okay, see, another great technological question. So the decline of the electric motor cars, there were lots of reasons, and there are definitely experts that will fight about why the electric motor car was either killed off intentionally or generally left to founder, and the gas motor eventually succeeded. Interestingly, in some of the early electric car advertisements and literature that I'm reading, especially about 1902, 1903, when you have steam cars that are still being marketed and sold, you have electric cars, and you also have this gas motor. And in this discussion about the turn of the century, many experts are writing in these journals or booklets that the steam engine has its benefits, but it's very heavy. And the electric motor car has significant benefit because it's more versatile and it can help advocate for more electrical implementation across the province or across the state. But the gas engine is too dangerous. It'll explode. It's an animal. It's a wild creation that you have to tame, and you have to be very careful because it'll just blow up. So there was this campaign that was discussing the different pros and cons to all these different technologies. And electric motor cars were then more frequently marketed towards women in many of the cases that I was reading, because they were perceived to be safer rather than the explosive gas engine motor cars. So I wonder if there would be a correlation between switching rules of the roads, or how quickly the technology could adapt to it, or how quickly they could keep up with flow of traffic in some degree, shape, or form. I don't know of a specific connection between the two, but I do know that some of the marketing around the electric car definitely facilitated its decline.
Would you be able to elaborate on the differences between North American and European car designs during these early years and how this impacted matters?
Okay, so there were a couple of different journals, again, about 1902, 1903, 1904, when these technologies were still in flux. They were still being radically redesigned by every small inventor, and they were all claiming that this was the design that would succeed. So the discussion about European models coming to North America is that they were beautiful, and they were elegant, and they were fragile. So if you tried to drive European cars on North American rough roads for extended periods of time, and they did several races that way, North American models versus European models, statistically, it seemed like the American models managed to survive the road trip more often than the European ones. There were definitely different designs in North America that competed. In fact, there was a time, I think it was 1905 or 1906, that the three-wheeled design was going to be the superior design, and everyone was going to be driving the three-wheeled car because it allowed for the frame to twist and bend as you go over the roads. And since the roads were really rough, flexibility in the frame is really kind of important for gaining any type of traction. But ultimately, that proved to be a little bit too much, and the flex on the frame ended up breaking some of them. So this claim that the three-wheel design would be the future of automotive history in North America, it didn't ultimately pan out. And the way that North American cars were then designed was for more rugged roads, rougher terrain, and not the more ancient or manicured roads of Europe.
In the 1920s, my mother's uncle drove all the way across the United States from California to Canada and ended up in Bathurst. What road would they have taken? Was that unusual?
I would say that is fairly unusual to undertake that long of a journey. It would be fascinating to know how long that took, because Wilby's journey took a long time. And there were several instances where they were stuck for days in the mud, or they had to completely navigate around certain areas. As for the roads in particular, obviously the standardized American roadway system that was formalized in a big way after World War II with the Eisenhower roadway system. So I wouldn't know exactly what road that they drove on and what it would eventually become. But cross-country road driving, if you will, in the States was apparently a little bit more common than in Canada, because Wilby did his in 1912. I believe it might have been as early as a decade before. I'd have to double check the dates again, when the first American transcontinental drive took place. So I guess if you were going to drive across the country in the early 20th century, it'd probably be easier in the US than in Canada.
I was wondering, were there races? Did they have like, I don't mean like, I know that there were races, like, you know, a bunch of cars going around and around and around, but I mean like cross-country races. It must have been an inspiration at that time, like who could go the short, how, you know, the fastest to get from one distance to the other. And was
Absolutely.
it like widely covered in the media, newspapers, I would imagine at that time?
You're absolutely right. There were transcontinental races, mostly in efforts to prove that this design or this engine is the engine to be, and this will be the future of motor cars. Because again, by this point, there was a wide variety of different designs and methods and ideologies behind them. So there was the intrigue of doing it and then doing it the fastest, but also doing it with this car or doing it with one driver. And this is actually something that I'm still looking into. We have record of the first female driver to drive across the US. But up here in Canada, we have Thomas Wilby, who did his in 1912. I don't know, and I haven't found in the records any mention of the first female driver all the way across Canada. If anyone happens to run across that, I would love to know. So yes, all of these races, or even if it wasn't, coast to coast, coast to a major river or coast to a major city, those were covered in newspapers, definitely.
I was wondering, are motor cars and all back in the 1920s all weather, all season vehicles? Did they keep the roads clear, both lanes in the winter time, or was there no need because they weren't a winter vehicle?
This is a spectacular question because environmental concerns and automobility, not just affecting the roads that you drive on, but you as the driver. So that's partially why we have the automotive fashion. You have the long driving coat, you have the driving gloves and goggles and cap and all of that. And oftentimes your chauffeur, of course, would have all of that in front. And you may be seated behind a little privacy glass or windbreak. So earlier models of motor cars were generally speaking open-faced. So of course you had those environmental concerns. It's going to be cold if you can get the car running in the first place. The sheer speed of 6 miles an hour would surely rip the skin from your face. A lot of these early commentaries on motor vehicle technology were concerned about the health effects of driving at such speed or in cold wind. And there were some of the falsely premised reasons why women shouldn't drive, is that exposure to the elements at such speed would surely affect their nerves. So there were different justifications that they tried to use to position a gendered lens on who is the appropriate driver of an automobile. As for operation in all weather, it was really up to your own sense of bravery and adventure and mechanical ability to then overcome certain situations. Chains on the tires, those were seen in the very early 20th century as well. That was not an uncommon thing. There are pictures from, I believe, 1905, 1906, 1907 that I've seen in the provincial archives that show local motor cars with chains on them in early or late winter. It's not a massive glacial mountain behind it, but it's definitely snowy in those pictures. As for plowing, that's also a great question because in reading through the engineering reports of Fredericton, the city, there are different mentions of plowing the roads, and they start coming up more and more frequently in about the early to mid 20s, because then they were advocating for trucks to help plow these roads. So plowing in the winter, I would say few and far between were the roads that were plowed.
John, was the left-right legislative debate ever explicitly stated in conservative versus progressive or modern terminology?
During the debates, there was one or two different mentions where they were discussing, I believe it was health, safety, and economic prospects or something to that effect. And I believe this was a comment by the Liberals, and there was a discussion about, we're doing this essentially to promote tourism, we're doing this to bring us into harmony. There was a lot of talk of harmony with other neighboring regions, and someone from the legislature then quipped, where did you get that idea? And the speaker then said, not from your side of the house. So there was definitely some political party banter that was explicit and clearly bleeding over from other debates and other arguments. But this is exactly why I really enjoyed this legislative, the crunchy, reading through the journal debate, is because it really didn't align entirely with a party one way or the other. It was proximity to the main Quebec and New Brunswick borders. That was pretty much the dominant issue, with the exception of a few members who were representing more like agricultural constituencies that, of course, didn't want to have to bother with switching the side of the road. And there was a great concern about having to retrain their horses, which actually that was reported on in the newspaper. So the more farming agricultural districts, they were not as in favor of this. Coastal, definitely, they were totally in favor of this, almost without exception. And there were definitely representatives along the main border that, of course, were advocating for this. But yeah, it wasn't as clean, cut and dry as party versus party. It was definitely location to the border.
In 1919, my great uncle, who was a Swede, part of the Swedish community at Nordin outside of Newcastle, was building trucks and delivery trucks. And there was a quite sophisticated brochure that went with this and so on. I mean, I was wondering actually, though, how early were cars built in New Brunswick? And was that an unusual thing for my great uncle to be building trucks, for example, in New Brunswick?
And you said in 1919, was it?
1919. By the way, I've put all this material in the archives, the provincial archives, in the last year.
Excellent. Okay. Well, then I now have something to add to my list to go take a look through. As for building cars in New Brunswick, as far as I know, it was fairly uncommon. I would say by 1919, there were a lot of major national well-known names producing cars. Of course, there were far more automotive families, if you will, in 1919 than there are today, when most cars are owned by 5, 6, or 7 major companies, and everyone's under a Ford umbrella or everyone's under a Chevy umbrella. So back in 1919, the names were starting to solidify. There were families and groups and styles that were coming in and out of fashion, going defunct, being purchased by others. As far as local New Brunswick production, assembly of cars and trucks, interesting that it was trucks then. I will look into that, not just passenger vehicles. I would say that was probably fairly uncommon. There were lots of still small scale producers, but I would be very interested in following up on that one. I'm very grateful that I got that information from you, that you were able to unmute, because now I'm excited to look into it.
Thank you so much, Sasha and Sean. We really do appreciate you taking the time this evening to tell us about your research. It was fascinating. I would like to remind everyone, or inform those who do not already know, that our program, our monthly program, does take a hiatus during the summer, but we do return in the fall. So in the fall, we have 2 programs scheduled so far. First, on Thursday, October 20th at 7 p.m., we'll have the Reverend Canon Dr. Ross Hab talking about a Canadian nurse in the Great War, the Diaries of Ruth Logie, 1915 to 1916. I love the. And then on November 17th at 7 p.m., we'll have Ian Barrett. And his presentation is, "It is a Holy War which we are waging, Bishop John Richardson in the Anglican Recruiting Sermons of the Great War, New Brunswick." So those are our programs. I encourage you to join us in the fall. So I hope to see you all after summer with all your tans. If you have any further questions that you didn't get in tonight, you can always contact the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum, all one word, @gmail.com, or you can give them a call at 506-455-6041. You can also check out their website at www.frederictonregionmuseum.com or their Facebook page, which is always kept up to date. And I guess that's it for tonight. I'll see you all in the fall.